So over the last couple months I've bought a couple of different commander decks, and today I was gonna open at least one of them, and later in this week, if I don't open all of them, I'll open the rest of them. So this one is a black-green deck called Elven Empires, and it's from the Kaladin set. Probably mispronounced that, but some of the Magic sets have unique and interesting names, so the pronunciation's not always easy. So, like many commander decks, it usually comes with a foil commander, a legendary creature that is your commander of your army, if you will. So, commander decks are a little bit bigger than your standard 60 card Magic deck. They're actually 100 cards including your commander, so it's your commander plus 99 cards. And some commander decks actually offer a couple of different legendary creatures so you can pick and choose which commander you want to use, as long as your commander is a legendary creature like I mentioned earlier, and it actually has to have the mana symbols that you're going to use in your deck. So where it's a black-green deck, this particular legendary creature has black and green for mana costs, whereas if it just had just green for the commander, I couldn't put any red, I couldn't put any black, I couldn't put blue, I couldn't put white. But where it's black-green, I can do black and green. So the one that they had for the foil commander was Lathril, Blade of the Elves. It's a legendary creature like I mentioned a few times. It's an elf noble with menace. Whenever Lathril, Blade of the Elves, deals combat damage to a player, create that many 1/1 green elf creature tokens. You can also tap 10 untapped elves you control. Each opponent loses 10 life and you gain 10 life. It's a 2/3, which it seems like you're tapping a lot of creatures to deal 10 damage and gain 10 life, but if you end up making a lot of tokens, then tapping a bunch of those 1/1s instead of potentially have them die in combat seems like a small price to pay. So next we have Ambitious cost. It's a sorcery that costs 3 in a swamp. You draw 3 cards and lose 3 life. So, blue generally has a lot of draw cards. Where it's a black card, it has that drawback of, you're losing life to draw the cards. Next we have Blight colors. It's an elf warrior for 4 in a swamp. That's a 3/3. When Blight colors dies, create 3/1/1 elf warrior tokens, then mill 3 cards. So it's one of those trade-offs again, because it's a black card, you're gaining 3 creature tokens if this guy dies, but you're also milling cards. Next is Blight Massacre. It's a sorcery card for 2 and 2 swamps. Non-elf creatures get -2/-2 until end of turn. So where this deck's mainly revolving around elves, you're hitting your opponent's creatures for -2/-2. If they have, some 1/1s and 2/2s, you're wiping those off the board, and you're also weakening, any of their creatures that are 3/3 or higher. So once you get ready to go into your combat stage, you're like, oh hey, let's get rid of some creatures and weaken the rest. Next is Eliza, Elena Scarblade. It's a elf assassin. It's a 1/1 for 2 in a swamp. You can tap it, discard an elf card, target creature gets -X until end of turn, where X is the number of elves you control. So again, where it's black, it's kind of a trade-off thing. You're discarding a card to weaken your opponent's creature, where it's -X for each, where X is the number of elves. You're probably going to kill whatever the creature is. Next, Meyer, Thorn of the Glades. It's a 1/2 elf scout for 1 in the swamp. It is also a legendary creature, but where this is a black-green deck, you wouldn't want this as your commander, because it doesn't have green up here. So if you use this as a commander, it'd have to be a mono black commander deck. Whenever Meyer, Thorn of the Glades, or another elf you control dies, you may pay 1 and 1 life. If you do, draw a life. And it has partner. You can have 2 commanders if you both have partner. Pride of the Perfect. It's an enchantment for 3 in a swamp. Elves you control get +2/+0. Prowess of the Fair. It's a tribal enchantment, elf, 1 in 1 swamp. Whenever a non-token elf is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, you may create a 1/1 green elf warrior creature token. So, it's kind of a nice way to get more creatures on the battlefield. When your creature, a non-token creature is dying, you're getting a creature token to replace it, basically. Next is Elvish Mystic. It's a 1/1 for a forest that taps for a forest. So I believe those are called, mana dorks because, it's a creature, but you can also tap it for mana. Next is Elvish Promenade. It's a tribal sorcery elf. Costs 3 in the forest. Create a 1/1 green elf warrior creature token for each elf you control. So, obviously the more elves you have on the battlefield, the more creature tokens you're getting. And with the way some elf decks work, you're potentially getting, several dozen off of just paying 3 in the forest. Next is Elvish Rejuvenator. It's a 1/1 elf druid for 2 in the forest. When Elvish Rejuvenator enters the battlefield, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may put a land card from among them onto the battlefield tapped. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So it allows you to look at cards and put a land onto the battlefield. That's kind of cool. It's nothing great for, board presence other than, getting a creature that triggers getting a land, and that helps get 1 card out of your library so your draws, you might have better odds. Fairhaven Elf. It's a elf druid. It's a 1/1 for 2 in the forest. When Fairhaven Elf enters the battlefield, you may search your library for basic land card, put it on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. So, again, nothing crazy, but it gets a creature on your battlefield, gets other land on the battlefield, and helps cut the amount of cards in your deck. So, again, helps odds of drawing what you want a little bit. Jagged Scar Archers. It's a elf archer for 1 and 2 forests. Jagged Archers' power and toughness are each equal to the number of elves you control. Tap Jagged Archer deals damage equal to its power to target creature who is flying. So, obviously where it's an elf deck and, its power and toughness are equal to how many elves you have, the longer the game lasts, the more powerful it becomes, assuming your opponent isn't playing a lot of kill spells or board wipes. Next we have Elena War Tribe. It's a 3/3 elf druid that costs 3 forests, and you can tap it to add 3 forests to your mana pool. So again, another mana dork. You end up getting more mana than a lot of mana dorks I see. So it kind of nice, nothing over the top though. Next we have Wise Elena Huntsmaster. It's a 3/3 elf warrior for 2 and 2 forests. Whenever you cast an elf spell, you may create a 1/1 green elf warrior creature token. So you end up having quite a few cards in this deck that are creating creature tokens. No Mage Shepherd. It's a 2/4 elf shaman for 3 in the forest. Tap 4 untapped creatures you control, destroy target artifact or enchantment. So, I mean, kind of cool. You have a creature that also allows you to tap some creatures to destroy an annoying artifact or enchantment. Numa Joraga Chieftain. It's a 2/2 elf warrior. Happens to be a legendary creature. It's 2 in the forest. At the beginning of combat, on your turn, you may pay XX. When you do, distribute X 1/1 counters among any number of target elves. And that also happens to have the partner ability, which is you can have 2 commanders that both have partner. Reclamation Sage. It's a 2/1 elf shaman for 2 in a forest. When Reclamation Sage enters the battlefield, you may destroy target artifact or enchantment. So that sort of reminds me of one of the slivers, I think, or something, slime something or other, maybe, but it was another green creature that was 3 in 2 forests, or like 4 in a forest, that happened to destroy a artifact or enchantment as it entered the battlefield. Springbloom Druid. It's a 1/1 elf druid for 2 in a forest. When that Springbloom Druid enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice a land. If you do, search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. So it's one of those trade-offs. You're sacrificing 1 land to get 2 lands. I mean, they're entering the battlefield tapped, so you don't get to use them until next turn, but if you happen to get this in your starting hand, it costs 3, so you tap 3, play it, sacrifice one of the lands you use to play it out, so you go from 3 lands to 2, but then you search your library for 2 lands, put those on tapped. You have 4 mana out on turn 3, assuming that you don't have any other things putting mana out before that. So kind of helpful early in the game, not so much mid to late game, because you presumably have more mana than you need, mid to late game. Sylvian Messenger. It's a 2/2 elf for 3 in the forest. Has trample, which for a 2/2 is not great, but if you have something to pump it up, it gets a little bit better. When Sylvian Messenger enters the battlefield, reveal the top 4 cards of your library. Put an elf card revealed this way into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library. So, I mean, you're potentially getting elf creature into your hand depending on what top 4 cards are, so thinning your deck out a little bit when you play that card, play that creature. Timberwolf Elf. It's a 1/2 elf for 2 in a forest. Tap. Target creature gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of elves on the battlefield. So, I mean, that's pretty decent, considering that, you know, you potentially have a couple of dozen elves. You're tapping this one creature to give another creature, you know, maybe +12/+12, or however much it happens to be. So where the last card, one of the last cards was a 2/2 with trample, you give that, you know, +12/+12, and all of a sudden, you know, you're swinging with that, you know, some of it's gonna trample through. Voice of Many. It's a 3/3 elf druid for 2 and 2 forest. When Voice of Many enters the battlefield, draw a card for each opponent who controls fewer creatures than you. So it kind of rewards you for having a lot of creatures, where this is a commander deck. Depending on how many people are playing, you might get to draw a few cards. If you're only playing against one person, not great, but potentially helpful. Wirewood Channeler. It's a 2/2 elf druid for 3 in a forest. Tap. Add X mana of any one color, where X is the number of elves on the battlefield. So, another mana door, you know, it's potentially helpful early to mid game because you're getting more stuff onto the battlefield. But once you get into mid to late game, it's maybe less helpful depending on your hand size, because if you have only 1 or 2 cards and they're, you know, 2 to 4 mana, and you're tapping this for potentially a dozen mana, you know, you're gonna have excess mana that's going unspent. But, you know, if you have 7 cards and they're all 3s and 4s, then, you know, that'll be helpful. Wood Elves. So it's a 1/1 Elf Scout for 2 in a forest. When Wood Elves enter the battlefield, search your library for a forest card, put that card onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. So again, another creature that puts land on the battlefield, you know, thins your deck a little bit, so kind of helpful to improve the odds of what you're drawing. Abomination of Winona. It's a elf horror that costs 1, a swamp, and a forest. It has vigilance and menace, which menace is this creature can't be blocked except for by 2 or more creatures. Abomination of Winona's power and toughness are each equal to the number of elves you control, plus the number of cards in your graveyard. So, you know, it already is a potentially big creature because of the number of elves on the battlefield, but then where, you know, it's also a number of cards in your graveyard on top of how many elves on the battlefield, it gets even bigger. And it happens to be a legendary creature, so it could potentially be used for a commander if you wanted. Golgari Fine Broker. It's an elf shaman. It's a 3/4 elf shaman for 2 black and 2 forests. When Golgari Fine Broker enters the battlefield, return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. So, I've always sort of like this creature because, you know, it's a creature, so, you know, you have something on the battlefield to attack or block with, but it's also when you grab a creature from your graveyard and bring it back to your hand, so you can play it either this turn or next turn, depending on how much mana you have. Moldarine Reclamation. It's an enchantment for 3 of swamp and a forest. Whenever a creature you control dies, you gain a life and draw a card. So, kind of one of those nice cards the longer the game goes on, because you're, you know, obviously attacking, blocking each turn potentially, so you're, you know, if a creature dies, oh well, you gain a life, you draw a card. By drawing a card, you thin your deck, plus have the ability to play out more stuff. If you have, you know, no cards in hand or only 1 or 2 cards, you know, then if you end up having 5 of your 1/1 tokens die, you have less creatures on the battlefield, but then, oh hey, 5 guys died, I gain 5 life and I draw 5 cards. So you go from potentially no cards up to 5 cards. So that, you know, that's pretty awesome. Poison Tip Archer. It's a 2/3 elf archer with reach and death touch. Whenever another creature dies, each opponent loses a life. So, you know, those 2 cards together, you know, you're gaining a life off a creature dying, and then your opponent's losing a life off a creature dying. So, you know, an easy way to make, you know, a gap between, you know, how many life you have and how many life your opponent has. Pertify. It's a instant for 1 swamp and a forest. Destroy target artifact or creature that can't be regenerated. Shaman of the Pack. It's a 3/2 elf shaman for 1 a swamp and a forest. When Shaman of the Pack enters the battlefield, target opponent loses life equal to the number of elves you control. So potentially it gets interesting quick. If you have a couple of dozen elves on the battlefield, all of a sudden you play this creature and, oh, bam, your, you know, opponent loses 15-20 life. Pact of the Serpent. It's a sorcery for 1 and 2 swamps. Choose a creature type. Target player draws X cards and loses X life, where X is the number of creatures they control of the chosen type. So, you know, again, if you have, you know, a couple of dozen elves, you know, you force your opponent to draw 24 cards and lose 24 life. You know, even if they have more than 24 life, you know, you bring them down some, you mill them for a little bit, so, you know, you bring it closer to a potential win depending on what kind of deck they're running. Ruthless Winona. It's a 4/4 elf rogue for 3 and 2 forests. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player sacrifices a non-elf creature. Where this is an elf deck, you're probably not sacrificing much, if any. But, you know, your opponent will probably be sacrificing something every turn. Serpent's Soul Jar. It's an artifact that costs 2 in a swamp. Whenever an elf you control dies, exile it. Tap. Pay 2 life. Until end of turn, you may cast a creature spell from among cards exiled with Serpent Soul Jar. So kind of a cool way to bring back some creatures from your graveyard. Seems a little odd to like exile them and then send them back to the battlefield. The only downside is where this is an artifact, if your opponent has something to destroy target artifact, whatever you have exiled, when this gets destroyed, then you wouldn't be able to bring those guys back, because they would then be in your exiled instead of in your graveyard. Bounty is Skemfar. It's a sorcery for 2 in a forest. Reveal the top 6 cards of your library. You may put a land card from among them on the battlefield tapped, and an elf card from among them into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So, I mean, you're getting a land and creature card, so you're thinning the deck a little bit, and a little bit helpful depending on what is in the cards you're looking for at. Canopy Tactician. It's a 3/3 elf warrior for 3 in the forest. Other elves you control get +1/+1, and you can tap it to add 3 forests. So it's a mana dork that is 3/3, so it's, you know, bigger than your generic 1/1 for, you know, that taps for a single land, and it gives other elves +1/+1. So I mean, that's pretty cool. That's, you know, doing a lot for, you know, mana dork. Crown of Skemfar. It's an enchantment aura for 2 and 2 forest. Enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 for each elf you control and has reach. Pay 2 in the forest. Return Crown of Skemfar from your graveyard to your hand. Wolverine Riders. It's a 4/4 elf warrior for 4 and 2 forests. At the beginning of each upkeep, create a 1/1 elf warrior creature token. Whenever another elf enters the battlefield under your control, you gain life equal to its toughness. So I mean, it costs a lot, you know, at 4 and 2 forests, but, you know, mid to late game, it starts getting very useful. You know, it's creating a creature token every turn for you, and whenever an elf enters the battlefield under your control, you gain life for the toughness. So, you know, your opponent's turn, you know, on their upkeep, 1/1 token to you, gain a life off that. Your upkeep, 1/1 elf token, gain a life off that. You know, starts getting crazy fast if your opponent doesn't have anything to deal with it. Odor Fang Venom. It's an enchantment for 2 a forest in the swamp. Attacking elves you control have Death Touch. Whenever an elf you control dies, each opponent loses a life, and you gain a life. So if you have a couple of dozen elf tokens, they get Death Touch, which, you know, you're obviously willing to sacrifice 1/1s because they're not your big creature. They get death touch, so your opponent potentially doesn't want to block them or doesn't want to attack to have you block with those. And whenever an elf dies, your opponent loses life, you gain life. So throw 2 dozen 1/1 death touch guys at your opponent. They block, say 10 of them. Your opponent has 10 creatures that die. You gain 10 life. Your opponent loses 10 life off your sacrificed creatures. Beast Whisperer. It's a 2/3 Elf Druid for 2 and 2 forest. Whenever you cast a creature spell, draw a card. Cultivation of Blades. It's a 1/1 Elf Artifice Ficer. Fabricate 2. Whenever this creature enters the battlefield, put 2 1/1 counters on it, or create 2 1/1 Thoreau artifact creature tokens. Whenever Cultivation of Blade attacks, you may have other attacking creatures you control get +X until end of turn, where X is Cultivation of Blade's power. Dwayne Guildleaf Dean. It's a 3/4 Elf Warrior for 2 and 2 forest. Also happens to be a legendary creature. It has reach. Other elf creatures you control get +1/+1. Whenever Dwayne Guildleaf Dane attacks, you gain 1 life for each attacking elf you control. So, this and 1 other creature so far have give elves +1/+1, and then this one allows you to gain life for all of your attacking elves, which is pretty cool. Elvish Archdruid. It's a 2/2 Elf Druid for 1 in a forest. Other elf creatures you control get +1/+1, and tap to add 1 forest for each elf you control. So another guy that gives +1/+1 to elves, and it's a mana dork. Enray's Forerunner. It's a 7/7 boar, so one of the few non-elf creatures. Costs 5 and 3 forest, which is obviously a lot, but it's good for later in the game. It has Vigilance, Tramp, and Haste. When Enray's Forerunners enter the battlefield, other creatures you control get +2/+2 and gain Vigilance and Trample until end of turn. So not only is it a 7/7 with Vigilance and Trample, and it has Haste, so you can attack the turn it comes onto the battlefield, but it's giving other creatures +2/+2 Trample and Vigilance. So that's pretty good. That's worth the 8 mana. Harvest Season. It's a sorcery for 2 in a forest. Search your library for up to X basic lands, where X is the number of tapped creatures you control, and put those cards onto the battlefield tapped. Then shuffle your library. So, something you would play after your combat stage, but before you end your turn, because it counts how many tapped creatures you have, and then you're searching for basic lands and putting them onto the battlefield. So you're thinning your deck, potentially getting a lot of land out, so next turn you can play more stuff from your hand. Imprecious Perfect. It's a 2/2 elf warrior for 2 in the forest. Other elf creatures you control get +1/+1. You can tap a forest in this creature. Create a 1/1 green elf warrior token. Marwyn the Nurturer. It's a legendary creature. It's a 1/1 elf druid for 2 in the forest. Whenever an elf enters the battlefield under your control, put a 1/1 counter on Marwyn the Nurturer. Tap to add an amount of forest equal to Marwyn's power. So another mana dork. Masked Admirers. It's a 3/2 elf shaman. Costs 2 and 2 forests. When Masked Admirers enters the battlefield, draw a card. Whenever you cast a creature spell, you may pay 2 forests. If you do, return Masked Admirers from the graveyard to your hand. Rise the Exiled. It's a 3/2 elf warrior. That's another legendary creature. Costs 2 in the forest. Whenever Rise the Exiled attacks, you gain a life for each elf you control. So another creature that you're gaining life off elves. You can pay a swamp, sacrifice an elf, regenerate, Rise the Exiled. Voice of the Woods. It's a 2/2 elf for 3 and 2 forests. Tap 5 untapped elves you control. Create a 7/7 elemental creature token with flying. So you're tapping a handful of creatures to make another creature, but with how many cards in here make 1/1 tokens, you just tap those 5 of those to make a 7/7 with trample. That seems like a no-brainer. Casualty of Wars. It's a sorcery that's 2 swamps and 2 forests, and you can choose 1 or more. Destroy target artifact, destroy target creature, destroy target enchantment, destroy target land, and destroy target planeswalker. So, kind of a fun card. I have it in one of my decks on Magic the Gathering Arena, because you can basically destroy up to 5 cards, one of each of those type of cards. Twin Blade Assassins. It's a 5/4 elf assassin for 3, a swamp and a forest. At the beginning of your end step, if a creature died this turn, draw a card. Arcane Signet. It's an artifact for 2. Tap to add 1 mana of any color in your commander's color identity. Soul Ring. It's an artifact that costs 1, and you tap to add 2 colorless mana to your mana pool. So potentially a broken card because you're paying 1 to get 2 mana, and where it's an artifact you can tap it, the turn it comes into the battlefield. It doesn't have summoning sickness like a creature that doesn't have haste would. Commander Tower, which is a land. tap to add 1 mana of any color in your commander's color identity, and it doesn't have that pesky, enters the battlefield tap thing. It comes in like a basic land would. Foul Orchard, it's another land. This one, Foul Orchard enters the battlefield tapped, so you won't be able to use it until your next turn. Tap to add a swamp or a forest, so kind of like a dual land, but it doesn't specify the land names and the card type. Golgari Guildgate, it's a land gate. Golgari Guildgate enters battlefield tapped. Tap for a swamp or a forest. Golgari's Rot Farm, which is another land. Golgari Rot Farm enters the battlefield tapped. When Golgari Rot Farm enters the battlefield, return a land you control to its owner's hand. You tap for a swamp and a forest. It's and, not or, so you're getting both. Jungle Hollow, it's another land. Jungle Hollow enters the battlefield tapped. Jungle Hollow enters when it enters the battlefield, you gain a life. It taps for a swamp or a forest. Myriad Landscape. Myriad Landscape enters the battlefield tapped. Tap to add a colorless mana. Pay 2 mana and tap. Sacrifice Myriad Landscape. Search your library for 2 basic land cards that share a land type. Put them on the battlefield tap, then shuffle your library. So, you can either tap it for colorless mana, or you can sacrifice it to search for 2 basic lands, which would then thin your deck, and you would have 2 lands instead of 1. Passive Ancestry, it's another land. Passive Ancestry enters the battlefield tapped. Tap to add 1 mana of any color in your commander's color identity. When that mana is spent to cast a creature spell that shares a creature type with your commander, scry 1. So that's kind of cool, because if your commander is an elf, you pay to play out another elf. Oh hey, I'm gonna look at the top card of my library. Then we get to some basic lands, obviously swamps and forests. And then after those we have a handful more cards. Elderfang Ritual, it's a 3/1 elf cleric. When Elderfang Ritual dies, return another target elf card from your graveyard to your hand. Poison the Cup, it's a instant for 1 and 2 1 and 2 swamps. Destroy target creature. If the spell was foretold, scry 2. To foretell is 1 in a swamp. During your turn, you may pay 2 and exile this card from your hand face down. Cast it on a later turn for its foretell cost. Return Upon the Tide. It's a sorcery card for 4 in a swamp. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. If it's an elf, create 2 1/1 green elf warrior creature tokens. Foretell 3. During your turn, you may pay 2 and exile this card face down from your hand. cast it on a later turn for its foretell cost. Its original cost was 4 in a swamp. If you foretell, you're basically paying 2, and then the next turn you're paying 3 in a 3 in a swamp. So total to foretell it, it's 5 in a swamp, but that 5 in a swamp split between 2 turns. Skim Shadow Sage. It's a 2/5 elf cleric for 3 in a swamp. When Skimmer Shadow Sage enters the battlefield, choose one. Each opponent loses X life, where X is the greatest number of creatures you control that have a creature type in common, or you gain X life, where X is the greatest number of creatures you control that have a creature type in common. Obviously, it's an elf deck, so elves is probably going to be the most common. So that's probably going to be what creature type you use for that. Tergrid's Shadow, and it's an instant for 3 and 2 swamps. Each player sacrifices 2 creatures. Foretell 2 and 2 swamps. During your turn, you may pay 2. And exile this card from your hand face down. Cast it on a later turn for its foretell cost. Elvish Ambush. It's an instant for 3 in a forest. Create a 1/1 green elf warrior creature token for each elf you control. And it's an instant, so you can use it on your opponent's turn or your turn. So let's say you have a dozen elves and you attack on your turn. It's your opponent's turn. All your creatures are tapped. Your opponent goes to attack you. If you have the 3 in the forest, hey, I would like to make a dozen 1/1 green warrior tokens, because that's how many elves you happen to have on the battlefield. You go from having, all tapped creatures to having a dozen creatures that can block some or all of your opponent's attacking creatures. Jaspera Sentinel. It's a 1/2 elf rogue that costs a single forest. It has reach. Tap an untapped creature you control. Add 1 mana of any color. So it's a mana dork that you're not only tapping this creature but another one. Kind of a trade-off. Slightly annoying, but if you need that extra mana early on, I guess it would be helpful. Roots of Wisdom. It's a sorcery card for 1 in a forest. Mill 3 cards, then return a land card or an elf card from your graveyard to your hand. If you can't, draw a card. To mill a card, put the top card of your library into your graveyard. So, kind of a trade-off. You're milling 3 cards, taking them from your library, putting them into your graveyard to be able to return either a land or an elf card to your hand. If you can't do that, you're drawing a card, so could go either way. Building the Old Gods. It's an enchantment saga. It costs 2, a swamp and a forest. As this saga enters, and after you draw a step, add a war counter. Sacrifice after stage 3. The first stage is to destroy target non-land permanent an opponent controls. The second stage is search your library for a forest card, put it onto the battlefield tab, then shuffle your library. Stage 3, creatures you control gain Death Touch until end of turn. So it's basically 3 instants or sorceries rolled into one card. So for a combined of 4 mana to do 3 different things, kind of helpful. Obviously there's different sagas, so some of them are going to be more or less mana, and the more mana, potentially the crazier they get. Harlan, King of Skimfar. It's a 3/2 elf warrior that happens to be a legendary creature, and where it's the dew color, it would also work as another potential good commander choice, because you're not limiting yourself to one color or the other. And it costs 1, a swamp, and a forest. So it's a 3/2 with menace, which means that can't be blocked except for by 2 or more creatures. When Herald, King of Skimfar, enters the battlefield, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal an elf, warrior, or Tyvar card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. And we have Skimfar Elder Hall, which happens to be another land, which seems odd that you had all those land and then you got into some other cards, but that's how it was in the package, I guess. Skimfar Elder Hall enters the battlefield tapped. Tap to add a forest. Tap 2 swamps, a forest, and this card. Sacrifice Skimfar Elder Hall. Up to 1 target creature you don't control gets -2/-2 until end of turn. Create 2/1/1 elf warrior creature tokens. Activate this only anytime you can cast a sorcery. So basically on your turn, unless you have something that specifies you can cast sorceries at any time. And then we have some of the tokens that have been mentioned, and they're actually dual-sided tokens, so depending on what card you have, you could use one or the other. And then at the back it also has a card explaining the different formats and how you would take your turn. So hopefully you found some value in this. Obviously a long video, almost an hour long, but you get to see all the different cards in this one particular deck, and then my thoughts on a couple of them. So thanks and have a good day.